The palace had a way of swallowing things whole. Secrets, grief, inconvenient truths, they all went in, and they never came back out. The walls were thick enough for that. The staff had learned, over generations, how to move through corridors with their eyes slightly lowered and their mouths pressed shut, because the alternative was too dangerous to consider. Everyone inside those walls understood the rules. Everyone, that is, except the people who had married into the family and brought their old lives with them like unpacked luggage that nobody wanted to deal with. Camilla Parker Bowles had spent decades becoming queen consort. It had not been a graceful journey. The British public had watched every stumble, catalogued every controversy, held on to every detail of the decade she had spent tangled up in a marriage that was not hers. By the time she stood beside Charles and became his wife in that quiet civil ceremony in Windsor, the tabloids had already written and rewritten her story so many times that the truth had become almost beside the point. She was the villain. Then, she was redeemed. Then, she was tolerated. Then, somehow, she was queen. It was the kind of arc that seemed impossible until it was just simply the way things were. But Camilla did not arrive alone. She had children. 2 of them, from her first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles, Tom and Laura. And Tom Parker Bowles, her son, had grown into a man who existed in a very particular and uncomfortable space. He was the stepson of the King of England. He had a famous mother. He had access to rooms most people would never see in their lifetimes. And yet he was not royal. He had no title. He carried none of the weight that came with the Windsor name, and he also carried none of the protections. He was adjacent to power in the way that people sometimes are close enough to feel the warmth of it, not close enough for it to actually be his. Tom had built a career for himself as a food writer and critic. He was charming in the way that men who have grown up around privilege often are, easy in conversation, effortlessly social, comfortable in expensive rooms. He wrote books. He appeared on television. He reviewed restaurants with the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of eating in very good ones. It was a life that most people would have considered more than comfortable, and, by most measurements, it was. But it was also a life that existed permanently in proximity to something larger, something that cast a shadow over everything he did simply by virtue of existing. The thing about growing up around royalty, even adjacent to it, even as a civilian, is that it reshapes the way you understand the world. Tom had spent years watching his mother navigate one of the most scrutinized marriages in modern history. He had watched Charles and Diana's marriage detonate in slow motion in front of the entire planet. He had watched his own mother become the subject of hatred so intense that there were years when she genuinely could not go certain places without being screamed at. And, through all of that, Tom had learned something that people outside the palace often missed: the rules were not the same for everyone. The rules were whatever the people with the most power decided they were on any given day. This understanding would become relevant later. It always did. Princess Charlotte was 7 years old when the incident happened. 7 is an age that people tend to underestimate, which is a mistake. 7-year-olds are paying extraordinary attention to everything around them. They are absorbing social dynamics, reading emotional temperatures in rooms, cataloging inconsistencies between what adults say and what adults do. Charlotte, in particular, had grown up in an environment that accelerated this kind of awareness considerably. She was the daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales. She had been photographed at a level of intensity that most adults would find unbearable. She had learned, early and, without anyone needing to explain it, that the way things looked in public and the way things actually were could be very different indeed. Charlotte was, by all accounts, a perceptive child. Those who knew the family well described her as sharp, emotionally intelligent, and possessed of a directness that sometimes caught adults off guard. She was not a child who missed things. She was not a child who could be easily managed with half-truths or redirected with shiny distractions. She noticed. She remembered. And she asked questions in that particular way that children have, with no awareness of the social pressure that usually prevents adults from asking the same things. The afternoon that everything began to unravel started in the way that these things often do, quietly, and with no apparent significance. It was a family gathering, the kind that the royals had regularly and which appeared in the press as warm, unified occasions, the sort of photographs that made people feel reassured about the institution. Charlotte had been with her cousins and various adults in one of the larger receiving rooms. Tom Parker Bowles was there, as he sometimes was at these gatherings, present because his mother was the queen, because Charles had made clear that his family was welcome, because the blending of the two families was something that the palace had carefully constructed a narrative around. Tom was relaxed that day. Relaxed in the specific way of someone who has had enough of these events to stop finding them nerve-wracking and has perhaps started finding them a little boring, which is the more dangerous condition. Boredom makes people careless. And Tom, who was charming and comfortable and used to being the most interesting person in a room full of people pretending to be less interesting than they were, had perhaps begun to treat the family gatherings with slightly less care than he used to. What he said to Charlotte, or rather, what he said within earshot of Charlotte, was not meant for her. That was the detail that mattered most, and also the detail that changed nothing about the impact of it. He was speaking to someone else. An adult. Someone he trusted, or at least someone he had known long enough to speak freely around. And what he said was careless in the way that things said in the wrong room at the wrong moment are always careless, not because they are untrue, but because the truth, delivered without care to the wrong person at the wrong age, can do damage that takes years to undo. The specifics of what Tom said are the kind of detail that the palace worked very hard to contain. But the shape of it was this: he made a comment about Charlotte's mother. About Catherine. About the way things had been in the years before the marriage had settled into what it now was, about tensions within the family that everyone privately acknowledged and no one officially confirmed, about a dynamic that had never been fully resolved and probably never would be. It was the kind of comment that adults made to each other all the time, a half-sentence shorthand for a complicated situation, delivered with a raised eyebrow and an assumption that the other person would fill in the gaps correctly. Charlotte filled in the gaps. She was 7. She filled them in the way a 7-year-old would, with the raw, unfiltered understanding of a child who loves her mother absolutely, who has not yet developed the social machinery to process information like this with any distance. She didn't cry immediately. That was the thing. She held it. She stood there for a moment in that particular way of children who are processing something too large for them, and then she left the room, and then she cried. One of the staff found her. Someone who had been with the family long enough to understand exactly what this meant and exactly why it could not be mentioned to certain people. The staff member sat with her, said the things that you say, and then did the thing that palace staff do when something has gone wrong. They assessed who needed to know and, more importantly, who absolutely could not find out. William could not find out. That was the calculation made in the first few hours after Charlotte's tears had been dried and she had been gently guided back toward something resembling a normal afternoon. William's temper was not a secret to the people who worked around him. His protectiveness of his children was not a secret either. His feelings about Camilla's presence in his father's life, and, by extension in the family, had been complicated for a long time. Anyone who had paid attention to the public record understood that the relationship between William and Camilla was not the warm, embracing bond that the official photographs suggested. There was history there. History with teeth. If William had learned that Tom Parker Bowles had made Charlotte cry, if he had learned what Tom had said, and to whom, and how it had landed, the fallout would have been significant. Significant in the way that family fallouts inside the palace are significant. It would have required management, messaging, careful navigation through competing loyalties, and probably a very uncomfortable series of conversations that nobody involved would have wanted to have. The easier solution, or what appeared to be the easier solution, was containment. So the story stayed inside the walls. Charlotte did not tell her father. She was 7, but she had absorbed enough of the world she lived in to understand, without being told, that certain things were better held quietly. Whether she made this choice consciously or simply instinctively is the kind of question that speaks to how early children in that environment learn to protect the people they loved by keeping secrets from them. She was 7 years old. She was already learning to manage her father's feelings by deciding what he didn't need to know. Tom Parker Bowles, for his part, appeared to be unaware of the full extent of what had happened. He had not seen Charlotte leave. He had not witnessed the tears. The comment had been made, the conversation had moved on, and, from where Tom was standing the afternoon had been entirely unremarkable. This was perhaps the most unsettling part of the whole situation, that something with enough weight to bring a child to tears and set an entire network of staff into silent damage control mode had been, from the perspective of the person who caused it, nothing at all. Not even a moment worth remembering. The palace moved on. It always did. The machinery of public image continued to operate. Photographs were released of the family at subsequent events, smiling, warm, unified. William stood beside Charles at public appearances and said the right things. Camilla conducted her duties and was photographed doing them. Tom Parker Bowles continued to write about food and appear at events and exist in his particular space at the edge of the royal world. Charlotte went back to school. The days accumulated. But the thing about secrets inside the palace was that they did not actually disappear. They were just stored differently. Pressed into the walls, absorbed by the carpets, carried quietly by the staff who had learned generations ago how to hold these things without letting them show. The secrets stayed. They waited. And the people who made the calculation that William should never learn the truth continued to make that calculation every day, with the increasingly fragile confidence of people who have convinced themselves that management is the same thing as resolution. It was not the same thing. It never had been. Charlotte went to sleep that night in her bed in the palace. The staff member who had found her crying had made sure she was all right, in the careful and practical way of someone who understood that all right was a relative term inside these walls. Charlotte had nodded and said she was fine. She was 7. She already knew that fine was what you said. In another part of the palace, Tom Parker Bowles was probably having dinner. Probably comfortable. Probably unaware that anything had shifted. And, somewhere between those 2 points, between the child who had cried and the man who had not noticed, a truth was being buried with the quiet efficiency that the palace had refined over centuries. William did not know. Not yet. The question that would take months to fully surface, that would grow in the space between what was known and what was said, was not whether the truth would eventually find its way to him. Truths inside families, even very large and very powerful families with every resource available to keep things managed, had a tendency to move. Slowly, yes. Quietly, certainly. But they moved. The question was what would happen when this one did. Because Charlotte had cried. And someone had made the decision that her father should never learn why. And Tom Parker Bowles had walked out of that afternoon entirely unchanged, without the weight of it, without the understanding of what a careless comment in the wrong room could cost a 7-year-old girl who loved her mother and had not yet learned to protect herself from the adults around her who weren't watching carefully enough. The palace held all of this the way it held everything. Quietly. Efficiently. With the long practice of an institution that had learned, through centuries of survival, that the difference between a scandal and a secret was almost entirely about who was paying attention. For now, nobody was paying attention. That, too, would not last. Months have a particular weight inside institutions. They accumulate without ceremony, without anyone marking them, and, by the time they have added up to enough of themselves, the original event that set everything in motion has taken on a different quality, softer at the edges, easier to dismiss, more possible to reclassify as something that happened and was handled and is therefore finished. The palace was very good at this reclassification. It was, in many ways, the thing it was best at. Taking something sharp and making it smooth enough to live with. But children do not reclassify things. They do not have the machinery for it. They carry what happened to them with a fidelity that adults spend the rest of their lives trying to recover, and they carry it into the next day and the day after that, in the background of normal life, in the specific and unbothered way that unresolved things tend to persist. Charlotte went back to school. She ate breakfast. She laughed at things. She played with her brothers and was photographed at events with the careful composure of a child who had been learning since birth how to exist in front of cameras. From the outside, she was entirely herself, clear-eyed, direct, the kind of child who made adults instinctively straighten up and speak more carefully. Nothing about her exterior suggested that she was carrying anything at all. But she was paying attention in the way that she always paid attention, which was thoroughly and without announcing it. Over the weeks that followed the incident, Charlotte began noticing something she could not have named but, felt with absolute certainty the way the adults around her behaved differently in certain rooms, with certain people. The slight recalibration that happened whenever Tom Parker Bowles was mentioned. The way conversations sometimes shifted direction with a smoothness that was slightly too smooth, the way her father would ask general questions about family gatherings and the answers he received were accurate but incomplete in a way that completed sentences could still be. She was 8 by this point, a fact which changed very little about the sharpness of her observation, except that she had an additional year of practice at doing it. She did not bring up what had happened. She had made this decision early and she held to it with the kind of consistency that people mistake in children for forgetting. She had not forgotten. She had decided, in the wordless, certain way of a child who understands power dynamics before she has language for them, that protecting her father from this particular truth was her job. That the cost of him knowing was higher than the cost of her carrying it. She was 8 years old and she had already taken on the job of managing somebody else's emotional well-being at the expense of her own, which is something that no child should have to do and which happens constantly in families where the adults are too important and too fragile to be told the whole truth. Catherine knew something had happened. She had not been told directly. The staff member who found Charlotte had calibrated very carefully what was shared and with whom, but Catherine was not a woman who missed things in her own home, and she had the specific radar of a mother for the emotional temperature of her children. She had noticed a change in Charlotte. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that required intervention. Just the way that a child who has been hurt closes something small inside herself, and you can see it in the particular set of her shoulders, or in the half-second delay before she answers a question that used to get an instant response. Catherine began her own quiet investigation. This was not the kind of investigation that involved confrontation or direct questions. It was the kind that happens through presence, being available, being consistent, being a person that a child could approach without consequence. She did not press. She waited. She understood, from years of her own experience navigating an environment where information was currency and its disclosure was always strategic, that rushing something like this would only compress it deeper. The truth came in pieces, as it usually did. Charlotte told her mother in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening, in the specific way of children who have been holding something and, suddenly, without planning it, simply let it go. They were alone. The context was unremarkable, something about homework, or dinner, or one of those minor domestic details that make up the tissue of normal life inside what was on paper a very abnormal one. Charlotte was talking about something else entirely, and then she was not, and in the space of a few sentences Catherine had the shape of what had happened, or enough of the shape to understand the weight of it. She did not react the way Charlotte had feared she might. This was the thing about Catherine, she had learned, through years of being underestimated and, then, very deliberately exceeding those expectations, how to hold difficult things without immediately making them about the difficulty. She held this one. She asked the questions that needed asking. She said the things that Charlotte needed to hear. And then, when Charlotte had gone to bed that night, Catherine sat with what she now knew. The calculation she had to make was the same one the staff had made months earlier, just from a different position and with different stakes. William did not know. The official determination had been that William should not know. But Catherine was not staff. She was Charlotte's mother. And she was William's wife. And the algebra of those two things, what she owed her daughter, what she owed her husband, what the right thing to do actually was in a situation where every available option had a cost attached, was not simple. She thought about what William's reaction would be. She knew it. She had lived with it for long enough to understand its shape precisely. He would be angry. Not in the small, manageable way that passed quickly, but in the deep and lasting way that came from something hitting a nerve that was already raw. His relationship with Camilla was not, despite the official presentation of it, a resolved thing. It was a managed thing. Managed carefully, managed continuously, requiring constant and quiet effort from everyone around it to keep at a workable temperature. The incident with Charlotte would not simply be an incident. It would be evidence. It would confirm something that William had been working very hard, for years, to not allow himself to fully believe. Catherine also thought about Tom. Tom, who had not known what he was doing. Who had made a careless comment in a room he thought was safe. who had no idea that a 7-year-old girl had absorbed his words and carried them out of the room in her chest and cried somewhere that he never saw. Tom was not a bad person. He was an incautious one, which is a different thing, though it can produce the same damage. Getting William's anger directed at Tom would have consequences that reached further than Tom himself. It would reach Camilla, and Camilla would be hurt by it, and Charles would be required to respond to Camilla being hurt, and the whole architecture of the blended family that everyone had worked so hard to construct would develop cracks that would take years to seal, if they sealed at all. Catherine was not naive about power. She had been underestimated often enough, managed around carefully enough, kept outside enough rooms for long enough, to understand exactly how these dynamics worked and what they cost. She also knew that the decision about whether to tell William was not actually hers alone to make. It belonged to Charlotte too. Charlotte, who had chosen silence for months, who had carried this with the careful self-sufficiency of a child who believed it was her responsibility to carry it. So Catherine went back to her daughter. Not immediately. She gave it days. She let Charlotte settle back into ordinary life, let the opening that had happened on that Tuesday evening breathe without being pressed. And then, she approached it gently, in the way of someone who understood that a child's trust, once given, was not a thing to be used carelessly. They talked about it. They talked about it more than once. Catherine explained, carefully, age-appropriately, that Charlotte was not responsible for protecting anyone from the truth. That the job of managing adults' feelings was not something that belonged to her. That what Tom had said, and the way it had landed, was not something Charlotte had caused or deserved, and it was not something she was obligated to keep carrying quietly because she was afraid of what would happen if she put it down. Charlotte listened. She was a child who listened the way some people read, taking in everything, processing it fully before responding. She thought about it. She thought about it over several days, in the background of her normal life, with a seriousness that sat on her in that way it sometimes did, making her look briefly older than she was. And then, she said that she thought her father probably should know. Not because she wanted to cause trouble. Not because she was angry. But because she had been carrying it for a long time, and it was heavy, and she thought maybe it shouldn't be a secret anymore. Catherine heard this, and the love she felt for her daughter in that moment was the kind that pressed too large for its container, the kind that came from watching a child find the language for something true and say it clearly, without flinching. She told Charlotte she would think carefully about how to handle it. What Catherine did next was not impulsive. She was not an impulsive person, which was one of the things that had kept her functional inside an environment that had broken more impulsive people fairly efficiently. She mapped it out. She thought about timing, about context, about what William would need from her in the conversation and what he would not be able to receive well if it was delivered wrong. She thought about how to give him the information without also handing him an already assembled verdict about what he should feel and what he should do. She knew she had one chance to frame this correctly. Not because William was unreasonable, but because this topic, this family, this specific intersection of his childhood and his grief and his children's welfare was the place where reasonableness was hardest to sustain. She needed to give him the truth without the packaging that would guarantee he received it as a call to war. She told him on a quiet evening. Not at the end of a long day. Not after a public event. She chose a moment that was as ordinary as moments in their life got, which was relative, but she found the best available version of it. And she told him what had happened. What Tom had said. Where Charlotte had been. What the staff member had found. How long Charlotte had been carrying it. Why Charlotte had eventually decided he should know. She told it simply. Without interpretation. Without the emotional charge she could have attached to it and chose not to. She gave him the facts of it and then, she stopped talking and she let him have the room. William was quiet for longer than she expected. This was the thing that did not match the version of him that the tabloids had constructed, the assumption that his reaction would be immediate, loud, and directed outward. He was quiet. He sat with it. He asked one question, and then, he was quiet again, and Catherine could see him doing the thing he had gotten better at over the years, which was finding the thing underneath the first reaction before acting on the first reaction itself. What he felt was obvious to anyone who knew him. Anger, yes. But, underneath the anger, something older. The weight of a history that had never fully resolved. The specific pain of learning that his daughter had been hurt inside a room he should have been able to keep safe, that she had spent months protecting him from the knowledge of it because she loved him and knew what it would cost. That a 7-year-old girl had concluded that his feelings needed managing more than hers did. That last part was the part that settled on him the heaviest. Not what Tom had said. Not the comment itself. But the months of Charlotte deciding, in her child's heart, that she could not give this to her father because the cost to him was higher than the cost to her. He thought about his mother. About the things Diana had carried quietly, the calculations she had made about what to show and what to keep hidden, about the way the palace had shaped her and him through the management of information and the weaponization of silence. He had grown up inside that machinery. He had vowed, in the way that children of difficult families often vow, to do it differently. And here was evidence that the machinery had reached his daughter before he could dismantle it. He did not go to Tom that night. He did not call his father. He sat with Catherine and he was honest about what he was feeling in a way that had taken him years to learn how to be, and she listened the way she had always listened, without trying to fix it, without providing the exit from the discomfort, just staying in it with him because that was what he needed. Outside the room, the palace continued to operate. The staff continued their work. Camilla attended her engagements. Charles did what kings do, which is move through carefully scheduled days with the efficient solemnity of someone who has been performing duty for so long that it has become indistinguishable from character. Tom Parker Bowles had a piece published in a food magazine. The photographs from a recent family event circulated online and were described, as they always were, as evidence of a warm and united family. Inside the room, William knew. And the very careful, very deliberate decision that had been made months ago, that he should not, that the wall should hold this, that management was protection, had come apart without drama, without explosion, without any of the things that had been feared. It had come apart simply because a child had gotten tired of carrying a secret that was never hers to carry. What happened next was the part that nobody had planned for. Because the plan had only ever extended as far as keeping the information away from William, and no one had thought through what would happen when the information arrived anyway. No one had thought through what William would do with it, or how he would choose to act, or what kind of man he would turn out to be when faced with the specific version of this specific situation. They had assumed the worst. They had built the containment strategy around the assumption of the worst. And they had not left room for the possibility that William, standing in the ruins of a secret that had been kept from him for months, might choose something other than what they feared. That choice was still being made. And, outside the room, the palace was very quiet, and did not yet know that anything had changed. The days after William learned the truth moved differently than the days before it. Not visibly. Not in any way that the staff or the press or the public could have identified. He attended the same meetings. He appeared at the same events. He stood in the same rooms and said the right things and wore the same composed expression that had taken him years to construct and more years to maintain without it feeling like a disguise. He was, from the outside, entirely unchanged. Inside, he was sorting through something that had no clean resolution. This was the particular difficulty of the situation. It was not the kind of problem that could be solved. You could not unsay what Tom had said. You could not give Charlotte back the months she had spent carrying it. You could not revise the calculation she had made at 7 years old, that her father's stability was more important than her own honesty, without understanding that the calculation itself was the wound and not the comment that had prompted it. William had grown up making similar calculations. This was the thing he kept returning to in the long quiet of those first days, the recognition that Charlotte's silence was not a foreign behavior but a familiar one he had practiced himself, one he had learned from watching the adults around him navigate exactly the kind of complicated, layered, managed family dynamics that the palace required. His mother had made calculations like that. He had made calculations like that. And now here was his daughter, 8 years old, fluent in the same silent arithmetic. The anger he felt at Tom was real. It was not performed, not exaggerated, not the kind of thing he needed to talk himself into. Tom Parker Bowles had made a careless comment in a room that contained a child, and that child had been hurt, and the hurt had been compounded by months of isolation because the child had decided the adults in her life needed protection from the truth of it. The anger was clean and it was justified, and William did not spend any time trying to argue himself out of it. He let himself feel it fully. This was progress, actually. An earlier version of him would have suppressed it immediately, redirected it, turned it somewhere safer, or dissolved it in duty. He sat with it instead. But he did not let the anger make his decisions for him. This was the harder thing, and it was the thing he had been working toward for years, guided in large part by Catherine and, in part by his own understanding of what the alternative looked like. He had watched the alternative. He had lived inside the consequences of unchecked anger inside the royal family. He understood what happened when people in this specific world acted from the raw center of their feelings without thinking about the radius of the damage. He thought about Charlotte. Not abstractly, not as a category, his daughter, his child to protect, but as herself, specifically, the exact person she was. The directness of her. The emotional intelligence she had shown in deciding, eventually, to release the secret not out of anger or wounded pride but because she had simply decided it was time and that she deserved to not carry it anymore. She had not come to him with blame attached. She had not come to him for rescue. She had told her mother the truth and trusted her mother to handle it, which was its own kind of maturity that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with character. He wanted to respond in a way that matched her. In a way that showed her that the thing she had worried about, that his anger would cost more than the secret, was not the truth. He wanted her to understand, without a speech, without explanation, that she had done the right thing and that the doing of it had not caused the catastrophe she had been quietly bracing for. The question of what to do about Tom was the other weight he was carrying. And this one was genuinely complicated, because Tom existed in a position that had no clean mapping in any normal family structure. He was not family. He was not staff. He was not a friend who could simply be cut loose. He was the son of the Queen, which meant that any significant rupture with Tom was also a rupture that reached Camilla, and a rupture with Camilla meant difficulty for Charles, and difficulty for Charles meant difficulty for the institution that William would one day inherit the responsibility of leading. Every move he considered had consequences that extended 3 or 4 layers deeper than the move itself. He thought about calling Tom directly. This option had a kind of brutal clarity to it. It would be immediate, it would be honest, it would communicate exactly how seriously William took what had happened. But it would also almost certainly reach Camilla within hours. Tom and Camilla were close. They spoke regularly. A tense conversation with William would not stay contained. He thought about letting it go. About deciding that the conversation that needed to happen was the one he had already had with Catherine, and with himself, and about slowly rebuilding the family's careful navigation of Tom's presence in a way that protected Charlotte without creating visible conflict. This option was not as passive as it sounded. It required significant ongoing discipline. It meant managing his own reaction every time Tom was in the room, which was a cost, but it was a cost that only he paid. He thought about what his father knew. Whether Charles had been informed at any point by the staff, by Camilla, by some other channel, about what had happened that afternoon. The Palace Information Network was not always visible from where William stood, and he had learned not to assume that his own ignorance reflected everyone's. Charles was a complicated figure in this. He was William's father, which carried everything that phrase had ever carried between them. He was also the king, which meant that what was good for the family and what was good for the monarchy were always in tension, and Charles's history of choosing the monarchy when the tension became acute was long enough to be a reliable pattern. William did not know if his father knew. He decided, at least for the immediate time, not to find out. Finding out would require a conversation, and the conversation would require a response, and he was not yet ready to have that response decided for him by the process of having the conversation before he was ready. He talked to Catherine. He talked to her the way he had learned to not to be managed, not to be redirected, but to think alongside someone who understood the full weight of what he was carrying and did not need him to simplify it. Catherine did not tell him what to do. She offered him what she had observed, what she had felt, what she understood about Charlotte's experience and her own reading of the situation, and she gave him the space to arrive at his own conclusions without feeling like he was doing it alone. The conclusion he arrived at was not dramatic. It was not the confrontation the tabloids would have written if they had known. It was not the clean, satisfying resolution that stories tend to demand. It was something more difficult and, more honest, the decision to act in the way that would actually serve Charlotte, even when that way was quieter than the anger wanted. He went to Charlotte first. He found a moment that was theirs alone, without the management of staff or the performance required by public spaces, and he talked to her in the direct way he had always talked to her, which was the thing she responded to most. He told her that he knew. He told her that he was proud of her, not for keeping the secret, but for eventually setting it down, for deciding she deserved to not carry it alone. He told her that what had happened was not her fault and not her responsibility, and that the impulse she had felt to protect him from it, while it came from love, was not a job that belonged to her. He told her that she could always tell him things. He said it simply, without the weight of a speech. He said it in a way that was as close as he could get to a promise, knowing that promises inside the palace had a complicated history and trying to make this one feel different, smaller, cleaner, just between them. Charlotte listened. She had the look she sometimes had when she was receiving information that she needed to let settle before she responded. And then she nodded. And then she said, with the directness he had always loved about her, that she knew, and that she had just needed some time to be ready. 8 years old. William thought about his own 8-year-old self. About what he had known and not known and what he had been ready for and not been ready for and all the things he had needed time to be ready for and had never quite gotten the time. He pressed it down. Not away, he had stopped trying to put things away, but down into the appropriate layer of himself where it could exist without taking over. Charlotte went back to her homework. William went to deal with Tom. Not immediately. Not that day. He gave himself the time to approach it without the heat of the first days, without the version of himself that the anger had access to. He chose his moment with the same care that Catherine had chosen her moment with him, finding the conditions that would allow the conversation to be received rather than just delivered. When the moment came, he did not have the conversation in a room full of staff. He did not have it at a family event. He found a context where it could be as direct as it needed to be without audience, without the additional layer of performance that came with being observed. He told Tom what had happened. Not as an accusation, but as information. He told Tom what he had said and how it had reached Charlotte and what it had cost her and how long she had been carrying it. He was even in the way he said it. He did not use more emotion than the moment required. He was clear about why it mattered, not as a slight against him personally, not as an attack on Tom's position in the family, but as something that had happened to his daughter and that he needed Tom to understand had happened. Tom was quiet in the way of someone who was receiving something they had not known existed, who was working through the gap between what they remembered about an afternoon and what that afternoon had actually contained. He had not known Charlotte was in the room. He had not known the comment had landed the way it had. He had not known any of it, the staff member, the tears, the months of Charlotte's silence, the weight of it. He said he was sorry. It was the kind of apology that came from a place that was actually sorry, not defensive, not immediately seeking reassurance, just sitting with it. William heard it. He acknowledged it. He did not tell Tom that it was fine, because it was not fine, but he also did not use it as a door into something larger, into all the complicated history that lived underneath it. He had made the decision not to do that, and he held to it. The conversation was shorter than Tom expected, probably. These things usually were, when the person delivering them had decided in advance not to use the conversation for more than it needed to do. What happened after that, between Tom and Camilla and Charles, what got passed through which channels and what remained unspoken, was not something William controlled and not something he tried to. He had learned, at considerable cost, the difference between the things that were his to manage and the things that belonged to other people. The conversation with Tom was his. What Tom did with it was not. The family continued. This was the relentless thing about families, particularly this one, they continued regardless. The events happened. The photographs were taken. The institution moved forward with its engagements and its duties and its enormous, slow-moving machinery of public life, indifferent to the private calibrations happening inside it. Camilla continued her work as queen. She was, by most assessments, becoming better at it, finding the register of the role that suited her, navigating the public dimension of it with less of the discomfort of the early years. She did not know, or at least appeared not to know, the full extent of what had been discussed and decided in the aftermath of that afternoon. Whether Charles knew was a question that remained, in the specific way of these things, conveniently unanswerable. Tom Parker Bowles continued his career. He was photographed at events. He was present at family occasions in the way he was usually present, warmly, comfortably, with the ease of someone who had found his footing in an unusual world. But something had shifted in the dynamic, subtly, in the particular way that things shift when people have had a direct conversation about something real. The ease was still there. The warmth was still there. But there was also a layer of awareness that had not existed before, a care that showed itself in small things, in the way he was slightly more attentive to who was in the room before he spoke, in the half-second of consideration that had not always preceded certain comments. Charlotte got older. She always had been getting older, but the year that followed had the quality of a passage. She moved through it with a new confidence that people around her noticed without being able to fully explain. She had set something down. She had learned something about her own capacity to ask for what she needed. These lessons do not announce themselves. They settle quietly into a person and become part of the architecture of who they are. She was still the same Charlotte, direct, perceptive, possessed of the particular combination of royal composure and individual warmth that made her genuinely herself, something that was harder to maintain inside the palace than it appeared from outside. But she was also someone who had now learned that her feelings were not too large to bring to the people who loved her. That protecting someone you love does not always mean carrying their burden yourself. That setting something down is not the same as abandoning it. These were things that children should not have to learn at 8 years old through the experience of carrying a secret in the gap between one adult's carelessness and another adult's need for protection. But they had been learned now. And the learning was real, which gave it a value that sat awkwardly alongside the cost of the experience that had produced it. William had done the thing he had set out to do. He had responded in a way that matched his daughter's integrity rather than his own first instinct. He had chosen the conversation over the confrontation, the direct truth over the managed version of it, the difficult but clean path over the easier but costlier one. He had, in a situation designed by everything in his environment to produce the opposite, chosen to be the kind of father he had decided he was going to be. This was not a small thing. It looked small from outside, which is the way that most of the significant things in a person's character look from outside: unremarkable, quiet, barely visible against the larger backdrop of public life. But it was not small. The palace continued to hold its secrets. There were always more of them, always new ones settling into the walls alongside the old. The staff continued to manage the information flow with the careful expertise of people who understood that their primary job was the protection of the institution, even when the institution's interests and the family's interests were not the same thing. But something had changed in the smaller world inside the larger one. The specific pocket of the palace that contained William and Catherine and Charlotte and George and Louis had been tested, and had not collapsed. Had not fractured in the way that so many pockets of that palace had fractured before it. Had held together because the people inside it had made, one by one, the harder choices when the easier ones were available. Charlotte knew her father knew. And the world had not ended. And her father was still her father, still difficult in some of the ways that fathers are difficult, still carrying his own weight of unresolved things, still navigating the impossible position of being both a person and an institution simultaneously. But also still there. Still hers. Still the person she had eventually decided she could trust with the thing she had been carrying. That was enough. More than enough. The palace moved forward. It always did. Through reigns and losses and scandals and adjustments and all the private calibrations that happened inside the official story it told about itself. It moved forward because that was the only direction available. Charlotte moved forward too. Lighter than she had been. Not because everything was resolved, it was not, and would not be, and she was old enough now to understand that some things did not resolve so much as they became part of the fabric of who you were. But lighter because she had learned that she did not have to carry the unresolvable parts alone. That knowledge, once it settles into a person, does not leave. She would carry it with her for the rest of her life into every room, every difficult decision, every moment when the easier thing was to say nothing and absorb the weight privately. She would carry the memory of the Tuesday evening when she told her mother the truth. The quiet conversation with her father. The specific feeling of something being set down. And, somewhere in the accumulated weight of what she carried and what she had learned to put down, there was the beginning of the person she was going to become. The palace held all of it. Quietly, and without comment. It always did.